Imagine this. Over 30% of war veterans have reported strange, supernatural encounters during their time in combat. That's a staggering statistic, isn't it? But what if the real enemy isn't human? What if the greatest battles are fought against forces that defy all explanation? As soldiers are trained to face tanks, guns, and fighter jets, they never prepare for what comes next. What happens when the battlefield itself becomes a place where reality bends? When the enemy isn't bound by any physical laws? Today, we will uncover the untold stories of war veterans who faced forces far beyond the human enemy. They fought supernatural enemies that defied all logic. Hold on tight, because what's coming next will send chills down your spine. Join me as we journey deep into the heart of war. Imagine fighter jets roaring overhead, their engines shaking the air with raw power, and tanks thundering across the battlefield, leaving destruction in their wake. Amidst this chaos, there are some veterans who claim that there's a darker force at work, a force that does not belong to this world. These men didn't just survive brutal combat, they fought forces that defy all scientific explanation, entities that shouldn't even exist. Supernatural beings, entities that couldn't be explained by the training manuals or weapons they had. These were things beyond human comprehension. The battle they fought was not only for survival, but for their very souls. This is their story, a journey into the unknown, where bravery and fear collide. For soldiers who face the horrors of war, the most feared enemy is the one they've trained to fight. Tanks, guns, fighter jets, and enemy soldiers. These are the enemies they know, the ones they can prepare for. But what happens when a soldier comes face to face with an enemy that defies every rule they've learned in basic training? What happens when the enemy is something you can't see, touch, or destroy with a weapon? It began with whispers, strange sightings. Soldiers began noticing shadows moving within the smoke, not human, but flickering and twisting in ways that made no sense. They heard noises, phantom aircraft roaring through the air when no jets were flying. Tank engines would rumble to life, only to fire upon an unseen target. Explosions would rip apart the earth, but sometimes the explosions seemed to come from nowhere. The veterans, shaken and confused, knew they weren't imagining it. They knew that something impossible was lurking in the shadows, watching them, waiting. But when they reported their encounters, society quickly dismissed them. They were told that what they saw was just the result of war-induced trauma, a product of stress and exhaustion. It was easy for others to label these men as delusional. They had seen too much. But these soldiers knew better. What they had encountered wasn't just a hallucination, it was real, and they had to fight it, even if no one else believed them. Let's begin with the first chilling story, one that comes from the Battle of Stalingrad. It was one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, and soldiers were enduring a constant barrage of artillery and sniper fire. The sound of explosions and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Amid this chaos, a soldier and his comrades took refuge in a bombed-out building, exhausted, their bodies aching from days of non-stop fighting. As they tried to catch their breath, something caught their eye. A figure appeared in the rubble, a soldier dressed in the enemy's uniform, but there was something off about him. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, an eerie, otherworldly glow that made the men's blood run cold. The soldier's movements were not human. He flickered and disappeared into thin air before anyone could react. For days, no one spoke about what they had seen. They were afraid of being labelled insane. They feared being ridiculed by their comrades, so they kept their terrifying experience to themselves. As time passed, more reports began to surface, this time from the Pacific Front. Soldiers on guard duty would hear the unmistakable sound of planes flying overhead, but the skies remained empty. No aircraft. Yet the engines roared, echoing through the night air, and soldiers swore they saw shadows moving in the fog. These weren't the normal shapes of men moving through the mist. No, these figures moved in ways that were impossible for any human to replicate. The veterans carried these experiences with them, haunted by the belief that they had faced something beyond mortal understanding. Then came the reports from Vietnam. The dense jungle was a place of death, where enemies lurked behind every tree. One night, a group of soldiers was on patrol, cautiously making their way through the undergrowth when they first encountered it. A massive, shadowy figure, cloaked in darkness, its shape ever-changing, moved among the trees, like something out of a nightmare. The soldiers fired upon it, but their bullets had no effect. They attempted to retreat, but the figure followed them. It moved with unnatural speed and grace, stalking them like a predator. The soldiers tried everything to escape, but none of them survived that night, except for one. That lone survivor lived to tell the tale, but he was forever changed. The others? They vanished, lost to something beyond this world. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a product of stress or fatigue. This was something that couldn't be explained by any rational mind. The men had faced an enemy that was beyond their understanding, and the weight of that experience would never leave them. The greatest challenge these veterans faced was not just the battle for survival. It was the fight against something that shouldn't exist. Imagine being in the heart of battle. You're in the middle of a tank assault, your vehicle moving forward through the smoke and the fire of hundreds of explosions. The sounds of war fill your ears, the roar of fighter jets, the blasts of artillery, and the cries of your comrades, and then you hear it. A sound unlike any you've ever heard before. It's a low, rumbling growl, but it's not coming from a tank or an animal. It's coming from the air itself, as if the very atmosphere is alive. The ground beneath your feet trembles, but when you look up, there's nothing there. That's what one veteran experienced during a combat mission in the desert. The world around him was chaos, sandstorms, explosions, the roar of distant battles. Amid all that, something shifted. Something moved above them, unseen, yet powerful. It was like a dark cloud hovering just out of sight, watching them. The soldier and his crew opened fire, lighting up the sky with tracer rounds. But the entity didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge their presence. The sky, illuminated with fire, seemed to only mock their efforts. In an instant, it was gone. The dust settled, and the soldiers were left standing there, alive but forever shaken by what they had encountered. They didn't speak of it immediately. They were afraid. They were sure they were the only ones who had witnessed it. But no matter how much they tried to explain it, there was no way to rationalize what they had seen. What they encountered was beyond any weapon, any radar, and any understanding. In the darkest corners of war, where fighter jets slice through the skies and tanks shake the ground with their firepower, there are forces that exist outside our understanding. These veterans didn't just face the enemy, they fought something else, something far darker. Their bravery in the face of the supernatural shows us the true strength of the human spirit. Even when faced with forces that shouldn't exist, they stood tall. The battle may not always end when the war does, and sometimes the fight is against something that transcends human experience. As one of the veterans once said, war tests your strength, but it's the unknown forces that test your soul, and it's in those moments that you realize how strong the human spirit really is. In the darkest corners of war, where fighter jets slice through the skies and tanks shake the ground with their firepower, there are forces that exist outside our understanding. These veterans didn't just face the enemy, they fought something else, something far darker. Their bravery in the face of the supernatural shows us the true strength of the human spirit. Even when faced with forces that shouldn't exist, they stood tall. The battle may not always end when the war does, and sometimes the fight is against something that transcends human experience. As one of the veterans once said, war tests your strength, but it's the unknown forces that test your soul, and it's in those moments that you realize how strong the human spirit really is.